Well, welcome to Greg Stidham's book launch with Silver Bow Publishing. My name is Megan Hakkinen. I am a two-time world champion ultra cyclist, the author of two adventure cycling memoirs. I'll start by introducing Candice James, the general manager of Silver Bow Publishing, who will speak a little bit, and then we'll get into Greg's portion. So Candice is a poet emerita for the city of New Westminster, as well as an acclaimed visual artist, musician, singer, songwriter, reviewer, workshop presenter, and self-proclaimed workaholic. She will speak a bit about Silver Bow Publishing and her experience working with Greg.
Working with Greg. Greg's just a pleasure to work with. And Greg is just, of course, a beautiful little gem. He's so easy to work. I love his work. I love the way he puts things together. And I think when you hear him read, you will very much enjoy Propolis for Fractured World. I didn't know much about bees until I read that. And I really have a brand new, wonderful respect for bees and what they do. And the poetry, of course, is exquisite. The company that Silverbow, well, we just try to put out poetry and we put out novels also. What I do is the one thing I do that a lot of people don't do. I actually put out some special needs poetry by people that are special needs people. And I do it because they need to feel good about some things too. You know, I know it's never going to get too far, but it's great for them. And I had a surprise once. I put one poetry book out by a special needs girl, and some club she belonged to immediately ordered 60 copies, which was very amazing. But yeah, I try and encompass everybody if I possibly can, and if I can't, oh well, I tried. That's all I can say. Over and out to you again, Megan.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Candice. It's been really a joy getting to know you and looking forward to, yeah, hosting this event. So I guess we're going to roll into the main portion of the evening. I will just kind of say that, and I'm really excited to introduce Greg. So Greg Stidham is a retired pediatric intensivist ICU physician, currently living in Kingston, Ontario, with his wife Pam and two canine kids, the most recent iteration of an ever-evolving pack of rescue dogs. Greg's passion for medicine has yielded in retirement to his other lifelong passions, literature and creative writing. He has published numerous poems in a variety of literary journals, several short stories, a memoir, Blessings and Intimacies, Pathfinder Publishers, a collection of short stories, Dear Friends, Pathfinder Publishers, and a poetry chapbook, Doctoring in Nicaragua, Finish Line Press. We're really excited to have you here today, Greg. We're happy to celebrate with you. Greg's going to read from his most recent book, Propolis for a Fractured World, as well as iced tea poetry. As mentioned, both books are available in ebook and print versions from Silver Bow Publishing. And I thought maybe to kick us off, I was wondering if you could share a bit about the origin of your interest in bees.
Well, I have one person to blame for that, and that's Pam, my wife. She recounted numerous stories from her way back youth when she was a beekeeper herself, and I got intrigued by it, but I was not motivated enough to get really interested and personally involved until there was this new invention called the flow hive, which I'll talk about in some of the poems. That greatly it makes beekeeping much more humane on with the bees, and it also makes it a lot easier for the beekeeper.
Well, I think that I can blame my significant other for getting me into lots of things as well. So we're really excited to have you read today, Greg. I am going to let you take the floor and maybe I'll jump in for a couple more questions as we transition between books.
Sure. Thank you, Megan, very much. And Candace, thank you for all of your help along this path. I really appreciate all of your help. The first poem from Propolis for a Fractured World is called My First Hive. And this is looking back on my first experience with my first colony of bees. The first time I lifted the lid, I leaned back, fearing attack by tiny yellow dragons. But what transfixed my gaze was a teeming mass of alive, moving, writhing, humming. Bolstered by a deep breath, I stepped closer and saw the single organic mass was not single at all, but thousands of individual bees. So busy with individual tasks, they paid me no heed, working tirelessly except for a curious few who stopped and circled my face on their nectar-laden flight back to the hive. The next poem is called Lying with Honeybees, and this kind of touches on what I would call a magical experience with the bees. And I can't tell you how many times I've just sat and watched the bees and, just felt hypnotized. So this one's Lying with Honeybees. Lying back in fresh long grass, surrounded by the scent of fertile, still moist soil, with dandelions littered about like a myriad small suns. I watch downy creatures drifting through an infinite azure sky, and I hear the contralto buzz around my head as honeybees busily tend their tasks, foraging nectar and pollen, blossom to hive, oblivious to my quiet breathing beside them. This poem touches on the same theme. It's called Mesmerized. A beginning beekeeper sits a few feet from his first hive's entrance during the initial spring forages. Watching bees come and go, he, unmolested, unnoticed, watches them descend from 20 feet high before breaking for landing a foot away, gently touching down, saddlebags full of orange or yellow, nectar and pollen from the neighborhood floral bounty. He watches, mesmerized, as though one with them. This is the stuff of poetry. This is Honeybee Early Spring. Like a shy girl at a high school dance, she flutters at a distance, unsure, before descending to the narrow yellow petals that have somehow survived Monsanto and Roundup. She knows there's nectar there, and pollen too, and her next generation depend on her success. So she dives in, inserting her proboscis, knowing her prize will either kill her or nurture the next newborn generation. So I mentioned the new invention, which was probably about 10 or 11 years ago, called the flow hive, and also called somewhat demeaningly by some a newfangled hive. So this poem is entitled Newfangled Hive. The older, more experienced members of the Limestone Beekeepers Guild made fun of us and our flow hive. That's not real beekeeping, they said, though they would not say why real beekeeping, with the need to remove the frames and shake the bees off, making them angry and defensive, aggressive, was better. They wouldn't say why buying an expensive centrifuge to extract honey was better. They were macho about their 100-year-old methods, and if our flow hive was not real beekeeping, then I guess we are not real beekeepers. I prefer my hive, openings in the back, frames that unlock and free the honey to flow like beer from a tapped keg in a favorite pub. The bees continue their business in the front, coming and going on their foraging voyages, not even noticing us landlords in the back collecting rent, save for one or two curious girls who take note and turn carefree, winking one big eye as they fly off to their flower fields. Dandelions. My father was fastidious about our lawn, the type of grass, the seeding, and later the sodding, zoysia, Bermuda. He pushed the two-wheeled fertilizer spreader until I was old enough, a chore for my allowance. Dandelions were a curse of biblical proportions, to be eradicated as soon as spotted by smelly petroleum poison squirted from a tank with a pressure handle. Today, older than my father when he died, I am an illegal urban beekeeper, and I've learned to love dandelions, embrace those first spring donors of pollen and nectar, to feel their tickle between my bared toes. These same plants are those my father's mother boiled to make dandelion greens to garnish the ham and black-eyed peas. I am now like I was as a boy, with questions. Why poison wildflowers to burn out a lawn for zoysia sod? Why kill these wildflowers loved by bees and loved by my toes, toes that slowly pace the ungainly yard we call our lawn, and I sign petitions to ban Roundup and to call Monsanto to account, and I pray to keep my bees safe. This next poem is about a different experience I had as a child. It's called Yellow Jackets. 6 years old, the boy stops kicking the ball in the short, newly mowed grass in the backyard near the house, and he watches with awe and curiosity his father pushing the new gas-powered mower at the rear of the deep backyard. He wandered toward the back with curiosity when suddenly his father howled, stopping the mower, and began running toward the house, followed by a horde of black creatures who turned also on the boy, who was soon attacked by the hot pinpricks of stings. Bee stings, his mother told him, as she rubbed baking soda paste on his growing hives. What he did not learn for 50 years was that these were not stings of bees, rather stings of yellow jackets, and for 50 years the boy was afraid of bees, deprived nearly a lifetime of the tameness of honeybees, wondering what he'd missed as he'd learned about bee society, their ways of communicating, their social democracy, and sharing of chores. And then he became a beekeeper. Honeybees are not the only pollinators. I mean, there's like thousands of species of bees of different sorts. And of course, there's butterflies and other flying insects that also contribute to the pollination that hopefully will save our fractured world. This is a song to a frantic bumblebee. This newly erected screened gazebo tent, meant to deter menacing mosquitoes and other merciless invaders, mayflies early on, yellow jackets later, but not our honeybees, who would be here only if they got trapped while nectar foraging, and also not the docile bumblebee, like the one today who found herself ensnared within this house of mirrors, screens that don't obscure the infinite, the beautiful universe without. She was frantic, flying nonstop, crashing into barriers she couldn't see, unperturbed by the keyboard clacking on the outdoor table below. Flying frenetically, nonstop, seeking a way to escape her nightmare until she was exhausted, unused to constant flight, without the respite of finding one after another dusty, colorful flower. And she paused, poised on a metal frame of this canvas structure. Then, like magic, the side screen was lifted, exposing the world as she knew it, and she darted out into the waning sunlight and back to her earthen hive home. Bumblebee. A white-haired woman in her 50s walks past my front yard wooden bench with her daughter or perhaps grandchild. Their animated hands converse excitedly, the girl behind mumbling to make her signing right. A furry jacketed bumblebee touches the tops of grass blades awaiting mowing. To her, the size of treetops, she, moving one to the next, as oblivious to me as were the woman and child. Mason bee, little known first cousins of honeybees, Mason bees are the black sheep in the family. They live their lives in solitude, follow no social rules, build no hives, don't strive against odds to survive winter like their cousins. Masons have no respect for authority, no queen to serve, worship, feed, and clean, no need to nurture an egg into a new queen to replace one who is sickly or aging and less fertile. The mason may lay 20 eggs in a lifetime, unlike her industrious cousins, 200,000 in a single season. Like her cousins, she relies on pollen and nectar for her offspring, but she alone collects from the flowers, while her queen cousin has 30,000 daughters collecting for the entire colony. Her drabness boosts the famous beauty of her cousin, always dressed in two-tone stripes, usually tastefully contrasting yellow and black, but the mason's colors are dull, grays or drab tan, though rarely a metallic green. In 1 week, the eggs hatch, then more weeks for the larvae to knit new shawls and wrap themselves in a cocoon for winter hibernation, emerging in the next season. Her nest is simple and small, one she will never occupy, but where she will lay her eggs in a line, 6 at a time, in a dark and lonely tube, a dark and lonely time machine. There is so much to admire about the honeybee queen who will live her life of 2 or 3 years, served by her generations of adoring daughters. But there is also much to admire about the black sheep mason bee, who will have a couple dozen daughters living her own life in one season, marching to her own drummer, and then die satisfied before winter, knowing her daughters will emerge in a few months when the weather again turns warm. This poem is called Goodwill. The honeybees hover over patches of color in the backyard garden, selectively descending on one flower or another, choosing one, finishing and flitting to the next, oblivious to the bumblebee, foraging the flower right next door, each going about her separate business. If you know what to seek, you will also see mason bees, maybe leaf cutters, and looking carefully, the diminutive sweat bees. They all arduously do their work in respectful solitude, somehow never straying into one's domain or another's. They work in peaceful harmony, no fighting over one flower, no defensive posturing, no colonial invasions. I sit and watch for them for hours, puzzling at their cordial coexistence, wondering why we can't live peacefully as they so easily do. Not everything is always rosy with beekeeping. This poem is called Abandoned Hive, and it reflects a real life experience, unfortunately. A routine visit to the honeybee hive to be sure they were thriving, foraging pollen and nectar, opening the hive and removing frames we thought would be filled with teeming hordes of honeybees, busily building new honeycomb, cleaning waxy bassinets for new eggs. But no, no bees, no teeming, naked frames empty of brood, no eggs, no larvae, just blankness and stillness. The only life left, that of yellow jacket robbers, stealing old honey, and a single wax moth picking at the remains of a post-apocalyptic city, abandoned and empty. Two more. The solo honeybee. The sound of a honeybee is distinct and distinctly different from that of a wasp or a yellow jacket. Honeybees are also rarely solo. They forage together, while wasps are more likely solo ravagers, which puzzled me on a spring patio sitting afternoon, reading poetry with the sun setting behind my back. The buzz caught my ear, the drone clearly of a honeybee, and I looked for her, thinking I might be mistaken. And then she appeared, circling close, but not threatening, and I asked her why she was alone at this end of day hour. She should have been home with her sisters, readying for darkness and a night of rest before next day's chores. And then I realized this is probably her end, the end of her 5 week life. This is what they do. They leave their sisters and they die in solitude. And this last poem, which is also the last poem in the collection, is actually a poem that's for my wife, and it's called Afterlife. Promise me you'll look for me, hiding behind the stalks of dandelions, littering the lawn we agreed not to treat. Look for me too in the rocks, the smooth rocks lining the bank of Lake Ontario, just blocks from where we lived, where small waves lightly lap. Look for me in the hopscotch leaps of the children who live just doors away, the ones with exotic names, Finn, Elise, Britton, and Clara, who wander home in herds of 3 or 4 or 5, usually a parent in the lead, or not. Look for me there, trailing along behind. You might see me there if you look closely. Don't look for me in church. I won't be there. Look for me inside the beehive, lowest box near the center, where the queen and brood busily are. Look for me in my closet, in my cluttered office full of artifacts. Look for me in your heart or the hippocampus, for it is mainly there that I can live on and somehow be found. I'll pause there and I'll let Megan jump in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Greg. You have a really strong voice, and it was wonderful to hear you read your work in your own voice. And I appreciate that you were able to kind of take us into the world of bees. And this is, I think something a little secretive and hidden from most of us, like city dwellers. And I love how you brought us closer to that and intermingled your reflections with interesting facts. And I this collection's being brought out into the world.
Thank you.
Got a couple questions before we jump into the second half of the reading. I was wondering, how did you find yourself writing poetry? Sounds like your career was a little bit different. So how did you find your way into poetry?
I think I was probably influenced a great deal by a high school English teacher that I had for several classes during my 4 years in high school. And he introduced me to poetry and all other genres of literature and also encouraged me to write. And I did start writing in high school, carried it on through university. Um, I started off with a somewhat traditional pre-med curriculum and got very annoyed at my advisors who said that I was taking too many English classes and I would have to take more science classes. And I just said goodbye, and I walked out and I changed my major to English, and I used my electives to take the prerequisites for medical school, and I fortunately didn't blow that chance. Um, so I wrote throughout university, and I wrote throughout my training in medicine and throughout my medical career, but not until I retired in 2012 was I able to really focus in a serious way on my writing and to hone the craft, which it is a craft. It's more than just you know pretty time sitting with a pen in your hand, and it does require practice and work. So so here I am. That's what I do now.
Wonderful. Oh, it's really cool to see that you held tight to your passion, even when it maybe didn't seem like the straightforward way of doing things. So we're glad that you kept writing.
Thank
My
you.
second question is, oh, sorry. What is propolis and what is its significance in the collection? I don't know if I've heard this word before. Yeah, I'd love to hear a bit more.
Well, I think I'm pretty sure there's not very many beekeepers in our guest list tonight. And I anticipated that there probably, well, maybe some of the people from churches will be beekeepers, hopefully. But in the very first page of the book, I give the definition of propolis. It's a red or brown resinous substance collected by honeybees from tree buds, used by them to fill crevices and to seal and varnish honeycombs. It is also said to have many medicinal and healing properties. So I like that image, and I like it's a micro metaphor if you want to think of it that way for something that is in scarce supply these days, and that is hope. Um, if we have propolis, we can repair our fractured honeycomb and hives, and if we have propolis, then perhaps we can heal some of the fractures in our fractured world.
Mm.
The larger metaphor is honeybees, because I think of them as being magical in their own way, and they also kind of represent hope. So I
Wonderful.
hope I answered it.
I think so. So it sounds like you have another book of poetry, iced tea poetry, that you're going to read a bit from tonight as well.
Yeah, and I'm cognizant of the time, and I'll try not to go too long and save some time for questions and comments. Um, yeah, Iced Tea Poetry was also published by Silver Bow Publishing last year in 2023. Um, and it's a very eclectic collection. It's a diverse number of themes, I guess, if you want to call it that. And I'll just read a couple. The first one is um, it's called The Possum, and it was inspired by a poem written by Ted Kooser, who, if you like poetry and you have not yet discovered Ted Kooser, he is my singular favorite poet for the last decade, and he's spectacular. So treat yourself and read some of his poetry. It's a lot better than mine. But I was inspired by a poem that he wrote about a possum, and so this poem is after his inspirational poem, and it's called The Possum. I read a poem about an opossum today that touched me and reminded me of a possum in the garage of my wife's former house. Like the possum in the poem, she was pink. She looked at us, calm, her pink tongue poised at her pointed lips, her pink fingers raised as if in prayer. She wasn't afraid. She didn't flee. She didn't attack in a frenzy of sharp claws. She sat and looked at us as though awaiting a fate she could not know. She let us guide her into a screened cage box covered with a blanket to keep it dark and keep her calm. We fed her niblets of dog food, kept a water dish full until next night. In the dark, we moved the cage to the backyard, lifted the screen gate, and waited, while she waited to see if we were serious about her freedom. Next morning, the cage was empty. Passing stroller in early evening. Straw boater perched atop his likely balding pate. John Lennon-like lenses straddling his nose. He followed the high-tech silver stroller, spoked wheels smooth and silent. He chattered endlessly to the chubby, barefooted legs kicking out in front, all that I could see of a happy child. Afternoon walk. We live about 2 blocks away from a rehab center, and there's a lot of people who have suffered um, more or less debilitating strokes or whatever, and they frequently walk around our neighborhood. And so this poem is called Afternoon Walk. Shaky hands on shiny metal handlebars, big spoked wheels turning slow like a fan with power turned down. He pushed her from behind. He stopped to fix the footrests, to hold her flaccid legs more comfortably, while the hot afternoon sun reflected from his brushed back silver hair before they resumed their afternoon walk around the neighborhood block. Um, this next one is called Morning Red Fox. Overcast Colorado mountain morning. 5 inches of snow, dead grass stems sticking straight up, 14,000-foot Chavano backdrops in the distance. And then the red fox stalks, 1 foot, one small step at a time, eyes fixed ahead. Then the bolting blur of a jackrabbit streaks straight toward the log cabin, fox springing into light speed chase till the rabbit finds the firewood pile and vanishes, while the fox slows before the wood, stopping, looking side to side, sniffing. Finding nothing, he wanders hungrily off, pausing by a tree to hike a leg, and disappears, the rabbit safe once more in the connected caverns within the woodpile. This next one is Dexter Loves the Snow. Dexter was one of our rescue dogs. We adopted him from the Humane Society in Fort Morgan, Colorado, which is it's a small town in the northeast corner of Colorado, right across from Nebraska. We got Dexter to be a companion to another dog who had lost her best friend, and she was in a really serious clinical depression. And Dexter was to be her companion, and he was. My new dog, Dexter, loves the snow, scales 4-foot snow drifts like a Sherpa, or leaps into them like an Arctic antelope. The railing on my backyard deck reaches to Dexter's neck, beneath 8 hoary inches, and is furrowed by his chomping jaws as he bites down on its edge like a happy snowplow. And the last thing that I'm going to read is comes from a section of the book I See Poetry. The section is all poems that were inspired by experiences I had during my medical career. And it's called The Lock. In the dim room with curtained glass walls, monitors dark and quiet, I watched him. With tiny manicure scissors, the type used to trim a baby's nails, he snipped a strand of hair from the very back of the boy's still head, a near-perfect blonde ringlet. He gently slid into a Ziploc baggie. Pausing, he placed the lock in the outer pocket of his duffel bag, likely stuffed with clean and dirty socks and underwear from 3 bedside days and endless nights sleeping stiffly in an overstuffed chair. He kissed the boy's forehead, stood and turned, nodded to me, and walked out the door. That's all I have for tonight.
Thanks so much.
Megan?
That was wonderful. It was great to hear from both books. I feel like we got like a 2-for-1, great bang for our buck. For anyone who has a question, you can add that to the chat, or you can raise your little virtual hand if you want to ask it. I have a few here that we can kind of get started with. So I guess first I'm wondering if you have any tips for aspiring poets or people just getting started in poetry. Any wisdom you can pass along to us?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is read. And then the third thing is read more. And read all the poetry you can get your hands on. And you don't even have to like it. It's good to read poems that are not your cup of tea, because then you learn things that you might want to steer away from just by your own taste. But read, and then write every chance you get. And you don't have to have a writing desk or a special place. You can write on the bus, you can write on the train, carry a notebook, and when you see something that startles you, it probably is going to be an everyday event or situation or a person, and for some reason it just strikes you, and write down some notes about that, and then come back and think about what is it about that moment that struck me, and in so doing you can elevate that ordinary moment into something that means more. It will have behind the curtain, there will be some sort of meaning that is not immediately apparent, but that's where the craft of the poetry comes. And so when you write the poem, that tries to accomplish that. You read it, and if you don't like it, then revise it, and then revise it again, and just keep doing it. And it's like any discipline, like riding a bike. It requires that discipline, and you just keep doing it and doing it and doing it. It's not arduous like riding a bike might be for me anyway. Um, it can be very well. It is for me. It's very enjoyable. It's a pleasure to write.
Wonderful. I think there's a lot of inspiration and practical tips in there. We have a couple of nuts and bolts questions. Someone was wondering, are mason bees the same as carpenter bees?
No. It's a great question because they're very similar, and they're about the same size. They look a lot alike, and the only difference that I know of is that mason bees they make a paste of mud and their saliva or whatever bodily excretions, and that's how they construct their nests. Whereas the leafcutter or woodcutter bees, they actually use wood, which then makes up the bulk of their nest. But they're also single season bees. They only live 1 year or one season actually, and then their eggs will they'll hatch, and then they'll wrap themselves in a cocoon that keeps them warm over winter, and then when the weather gets warm again, they hatch out of their cocoon and they go and they make more mason bees or leafcutter bees.
Interesting. You bring such a wealth of knowledge. Again, I think that's why this collection is a treat.
Well, it's crazy because I was so fascinated. I learned everything I could learn about bees, and the more I learned, the more daunting it became because the more I realized that how much more I need to learn. It's a never-ending challenge to learn about bees, and I'm always learning something new. And I do love them. I mean, I think they're really special. They communicate. They have a social hierarchy. They have individual chores that they take on within the context of the social structure of the hive at different times in their lives, which the worker bees, their lifespan is 5 weeks. But in those 5 weeks, they'll take on 6 or 7 different chores that include being the masons that build the hive, the contractors that repair the hive, the nursemaids that feed the eggs and the larvae, the caretakers of the queen. You know, she has her little entourage, and they literally surround her and they keep her clean. And all she does is lay eggs, at 10,000 a day or something incredible. They're even undertakers because the bees sometimes, most of the time when they're dying, they'll fly off and they'll die in solitude. But sometimes they die in the hive, and they're so fastidious about keeping the hive clean that some of them are assigned the task of cleaning out whatever's not supposed to be in the hive, which includes dead bees. So yeah, they're fascinating.
So we have a question kind of related to that. It's from John, and he says, I'm not a beekeeper, but appreciate bees more now than ever. I'll be kinder and more considerate in the future, I promise. The question is, what do you do to get your swarming bees back into the hive? I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit.
Okay, bees, the way they reproduce their species, or they propagate their species, the hive will become overcrowded. Ideally, that's the reason that they leave the hive. And the queen will take off with approximately a third to a half of the colony. And there's usually somewhere between 25 and 30,000 bees in a colony. So she'll take off with 15,000 bees. One of the people who's in our audience or was here earlier is my next door neighbor, who has become an expert in bee swarms because we've had probably 3 or 4 swarms over the 10 years that we've been doing this. And the queen and a bunch of her daughters they'll go about 20 feet away, and the nearest tree happens to be right in his yard, right next to our fence, right next to the beehive where we keep the beehive. So they go up there and they form this cluster. It's about half again the size of a basketball, but it's shaped like a gourd. and they'll hang out there for like maybe 12 to 24 hours, during which time they'll send off these scout bees looking for another place to live. And then when they find it, they'll come back and they'll communicate with the whole half colony that's there and say, okay, this is a good place, and they'll sort of collectively decide that they'll go. And then all of a sudden they take off and they go to their new hive. And yes, beekeepers are very eager to capture those bees and to rehome them into a new hive in their apiary. We've never recaptured. There are certain things that you can do. If you can climb up and you can shake the limb that they're hanging from and get them to drop down into a bucket or a big cloth or something like that, you can capture them, and the queen will most likely be there, and then you can then keep them. But I think we've just furnished other people with honey in our neighborhood.
Well, thanks for sharing a bit more about the process. Yeah, that's it's such a different world than the world that I walk around shaking bees down from branches and things.
Yeah.
So this was also from John. Any specific incident that inspired poetry? Page 69.
What was the last part of the question?
Any specific incident that inspired poetry? 69.
That,
Poetry
that's page 69, Greg.
Page 69. Well, 69 was the year I graduated from high school, so I don't know.
No, I wasn't going there, Greg. In fact, I'm probably the one on here that knows Greg the longest. He and I went to high school together. We graduated 55 years ago, so it's nice to see Greg and say hi and realize. Let me say a little bit about Greg. First of all, never give me an open mic, but Greg and I started high school with over 500 guys in our class. 100 didn't make it. They flew someplace else, shall we say. And out of the 400 plus guys in the class, Greg was probably in the top five. So you're listening not only to a poet, but someone who generally is on the borderline of brilliant. So, Greg, page 69 of your poetry book, there's a poem called Poetry. And in there, you kind of cite that it was inspired by maybe a specific, not iced tea, not iced tea.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry for the page 69 reference. I never occurred to me that you might consider that the year we graduated. So it seemed like there might have been a specific incident, possibly in the United States, that caused you to write that, or maybe it was a worldwide incident.
Okay, it's a different sort of poem for me a little bit because it starts off very pastoral, I guess is a good word. The first two stanzas describe a day in Ontario and the sudden onset of a thunderstorm, and then I'm taken away to some current events that were happening at the time, and I jump into some socio-political commentary about police brutality and white on black violence, and I say I mourn my country of origin and write poetry while meditating to the hum of honeybees. Yeah, I think that was probably written. I'm not sure, probably around the time of George Floyd or many other incidents, and especially in the States, which caused me sadness, almost despair sometimes, and then I bring it back, and the honeybees are solace to me. So I guess it wasn't a single event that inspired or triggered that poem, but just the cumulative effect of what was going on around me, and the healing nature of honeybees, and that they do bring hope. Thanks for mentioning that. I appreciate that.
Well, it's an incident that's fairly current in the United States and highly unfortunate. And because it is so current, Greg, I mean, Greg and I have traded emails. We got reintroduced in the last 5 years or so. Greg, how much time, when did you start writing the poems for your most recent book? And how long, how many hours do you think you have in it? Because I know you put your heart and soul into writing.
I can't, I don't count the hours. I mean, they just kind of fly by, and I really enjoy the writing and the processes that go on up here and in here that lead to the writing. I enjoy all of that so much that I couldn't even hazard a guess as to how many hours. Um, the poems that this book is kind of interesting because I've been writing about bees ever since I became a beekeeper, which was 10 years ago. And so I had a handful of poems, and I thought, they're on a single theme. And there's two kinds of poetry collections. One is called a chapbook, and they're generally shorter. And Candace, you can correct me if I'm misstating this, but they're usually 18 to 22 or 23 poems, or even maybe even a few fewer than that. So they're short, but they're all on a single theme. So I had these bee themed poems that I'd written over years, and I thought, this would make an interesting chapbook. And so I asked Candace to look at them and see what she thought. And she wrote, I remember exactly what she wrote back. She said, these poems are begging to be made into an entire collection, which meant that I had to now write an equal number of poems to make it the size of a full-length collection. And and the first poems were they just came from spontaneous moments where I'd be sitting with my bees, or watching uh, the people across the street, the deaf girl trying to sign. They were sort of spontaneous things. And now I was being asked to write another 15 or so poems with a prompt. Now, that's not uncommon. I mean, that's an exercise that a lot of poets will use, and you can buy books of prompts for poetry, and it'll be like you're assigned, write a poem about asphalt, or in this case, write 15 or 20 poems about bees. And I thought at first it's like I was quite daunted. And but I've written prompted poems before, and I thought this is no different really. And so it's a challenge to the imagination. And in fact, this was when I was on a 5,000-mile trip across Canada. We went from Kingston, which is in way eastern Ontario. Well, we went to Kalispell, Montana, which is just south of Calgary, and then we went up and crossed. We crossed two-thirds of Alberta, all of Saskatchewan, all of Manitoba, and two-thirds of Ontario, and it was 5,000 miles. And we had a camper trailer and two dogs with us and everything, and so we would stop at night, and I would just write, and that went along well until I spilled a glass of wine on my computer keyboard and it stopped working, and it was before. Okay, Jack, don't laugh because I know what you're thinking. And I had not even taken a sip of that wine yet, which made me all the more frustrated and angry. But anyway, so it was kind of a mishmash of these spontaneous ones that just came to me, and other ones that were, more driven. And I guess it holds together okay. I think so.
Yeah, it's very entertaining, quite honestly. I only have two more comments and then I'll cut my mic. The afterlife poem. I sat down because I was taking a friend to the hospital yesterday. I had time to finally get into the book, Greg, and for some reason I missed the afterlife poem, and it's the best of what's in there. And someday I hope to meet and talk to Pam, what it means to her. And then secondly, let me plug two other books. The memoirs is, if other people haven't read your books, the memoirs and the short stories are delightful. You learn a lot about Greg. Get them as quickly as possible. Amen.
Thanks, Jack. It's great to see you after 55 years.
Only my true friends call me Jack, and he's one of them.
We've got a couple more questions in the chat. Candace was wondering, what is the difference in the honey quality from domesticated hive and natural hive? Is there a difference?
From the difference between natural honey just straight from the hive versus honey that you buy in the store? Is that the question? Or
No,
Yeah, what is
no, that's not the question. The other ones you see hanging out in nature that are actual honeybee ones hanging in nature, those ones. What would the quality from them be different from the ones where they're tended to by a beekeeper?
I think there's probably no difference at all. I mean, what makes different honeys different from each other is the season and what flowers are prominent during that particular time of the
Mhm.
season. So, early in spring, even before the dandelions and the crocuses and the snowdrops come out, the pine trees actually give off nectar and pollen. So they'll be foraging evergreen stuff. So if you taste the honey really early in the season, it'll have kind of this evergreen hint to it. And then as the flowers change, you get different flowers at different times of the year. The dandelions come on and they'll have a different kind of flavor. And also obviously the locale will influence what kind of nectar and pollen they're getting. So when we used to go to the Lime Keepers Association, I mean the Limestone Beekeepers Association, there was a person there who had traveled to Guatemala, and she brought back some honey, and it was almost entirely nectar and pollen that was derived from coffee beans or from coffee plants. And it was like so dark and so rich. I just wanted to steal it from her, but I didn't.
That'd be
uh,
something
we,
like that. Oka honey, because that's really dark. Yes, no? Who knows? I don't know. I just thought I'd ask.
Well, did I answer it okay? I think
Yeah, I
if
was
there
just asking. I was just asking, is that have you ever had manuka honey? Is that what the dark roasted honey would be like?
Manuka honey is a different plant. It's not coffee, and I think is it from Australia or Hawaii?
All I know is it's not from here.
Yeah, no, I don't. It's not from North America at all. But it's prized honey. I mean, it must be really good. I don't know that I've ever tasted it, to be honest with you, but um, it's you pay an appropriate price for it coming from Australia or Hawaii, whichever it is.
I got some and tried it once because I read somewhere it was good for healing. So I thought, well, I need to heal something. So I'll take some. And actually, amazingly enough, it did it did heal. So that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's antibacterial and antiviral properties within the honey itself. And to underscore that fact, the oldest honey um, was found in the mountains of the state of Georgia, and I guess the Caspian Mountains, and it was like from 3,000 years BC. And I know BC is not the right term anymore, but I can't remember what it's
Mhm.
AE or something. But and it was found, and it was totally pure. It was totally sterile, and I guess they tasted it. And you can Google it and find out about that because it's pretty interesting. I mean, it was like 6,000 years old, you know. Was it was jarred, put in a jar by Cro-Magnon or something.
That's incredible to think about. Yeah. We have a question from Jim, and he asks, how did your experience as an editor in high school and continuing in university influence your interest in writing and the choice to focus on poetry?
Uh, how did it in? I would say that the impetus was already there, and it was just nurtured by uh, my experience doing writing and editing the literary magazine in high school. And I know I don't see Jim's I didn't see Jim's name here, but I know who it is now. Hi Jim, wherever you are.
I think
Okay.
that brings us to the end of the listed questions. I guess I wanted to check, did anybody want to read anything at an open mic before we wrap up? Put your little hand up or shout or something. Just scrolling through. I don't see any open mic takers. So, um, if anybody has another question for Greg, I think we have, a couple more minutes. If there's something you've been dying to ask the author, jump in right now.
I remember Greg editing our literary magazine in high school. It was called Flight, and that's because our mascot at St. Ed's was an eagle. Uh, hey, Greg, do I know Jim on this
Yeah,
chat?
I think you probably do. It's if I'm not mistaken, it's Jim Power,
Okay.
Pauer, and he was on the staff for the flight as well.
Oh, okay.
Wow,
What a great reunion.
I can't believe those ancient neurons are still synapsing.
Oh, that's wonderful. Bit of a reunion.
Well, he didn't make it to the 55th reunion, but that's okay. He's given us a good reason why he stayed put. Hey, Greg, did you ever have to use either of those EpiPens from the EpiPen poem?
No, no, not yet.
was going to say, maybe you can hear me. Since there's no open micers, I'll do one quick one. Boy, is it quick, and it's so wrong because I don't write haiku, but when I do, I can't stand the rules, so I stay right within the actual syllables. But you're not supposed to title them, and I title mine. So this one is called "Fighting Flowers." Sweet William reverts to pugilism again. Hence, black-eyed Susan. And that's it.
Thanks, Candace. That was a lovely way to wrap things up tonight. Well, I guess I'd like to thank Greg for being here and sharing your words and giving us two excellent readings. To Candace for, being at the helm of Silver Bow Publishing and all of your really hard work in bringing these books to life. And then everyone in attendance today. Thanks for being here to celebrate with us. Thanks for putting your questions in the chat and being engaged. Let's have a round of applause for all of us.
I want to add my thanks to everybody who joined us tonight too. I really appreciate the opportunity to connect through poetry to like-minded people who seem to like poetry as well. It's always a pleasure. So thank you, and thank you, Megan and Candace.